Next, from Springfield, we sit down for a one-on-one interview with Kash Jackson, the Libertarian candidate for governor. We talk to Mr. Jackson about his gubernatorial agenda, why voters are not throwing their vote away by voting for a third-party candidate, and his efforts to fight back against what he sees as unjust treatment of fathers in family court. This runs about 50 minutes.
Kash Jackson, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thank you for having me.
We are sitting here on a day when you have announced, as far as the gubernatorial candidate for the Libertarian Party of Illinois, that you have successfully achieved enough signatures to get you onto the ballot for the November election. In fact, close to twice as many as you need to have. You need to have 25,000. I believe you collected something like 47,000 signatures around the state. So even though those will, I'm sure, be challenged to some extent, with a 2-for-1 margin, I'm going to guess that you end up with still having at least 25,000 that'll have you on the ballot. So that said, let's talk about why you're running for governor and why as a Libertarian candidate. Let's just start there.
At the most basic reason on why I'm running, it's for my kids. It's for my family and future generations. It's because I swore to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And when I realized that the greatest harm being done to my family and I and my community was at the hands of our elected officials, I made a decision to spend my time trying to become the governor of Illinois. And it wasn't a decision that I came to very easily, because I knew from, and we'll probably get into it in the interview, but I knew from my family court case in my past that a lot of these things are going to come to light, and I needed for them to. I needed for those things to be pulled into the media and discussed, because they're not being talked about. And the Libertarian Party was the one that fit the mold for what I really believed our founding fathers had intended, that we have the ability to live alongside one another peacefully and to utilize self-determination in deciding what's good for me and my family without having government interference in that. And Republicans and Democrats are very authoritarian, and they don't represent myself or my belief system. And so it just made sense for me to be a libertarian.
A lot of people that I've talked to over the years, I think, are increasingly describing themselves as fiscally conservative but socially moderate. How does that description fit in with the Libertarian Party?
I think it fits in very well, actually. A lot of libertarians believe that taxation on its face is theft, because it's a contract that you're entered into that you never got to negotiate. And the fruits of your labor, of any man's labor, should really naturally be theirs, that they decide what happens with it. But that's not what we live in. We live in a day and age in which taxation is normal. It's a part of our infrastructure and an expanding of jobs and industry, and there's a tremendous amount of people and systems in place that rely upon taxes. And so we kind of view them as, unfortunately, at this time, a necessary evil that we'll work within the scope of, but we want to reduce it. I want you and every other citizen to keep as much of your hard-earned money, because that money didn't just appear in your bank account. You had to make sacrifices. You had to labor. You had to get an education and show up to work day in and day out and spend time away from your family. To me, it's completely immoral that government continues to expand and take more and more from you and your labor and your sacrifices. That should be yours. And that's what I think most people are okay with. They can swallow and deal with taxation. They just want it to be spent responsibly. That's what I want. I want whatever money that the government takes in taxes, I want it spent responsibly. And because we need it, not because we want it, and not because we want to expand more government. I want to shrink government. And so, yeah, libertarians are very fiscally conservative, and socially, depending on who you're talking to, they could be a little bit more left or right, but for the most part, I think we're mostly moderate. That I don't have to agree with your lifestyle or your belief system. but I want you to be able to live out your life and your belief system however you see fit without infringing upon other people's rights. And I think that that's most of our nation.
Well, in America, if you look at our founding on religious liberty, that people left England because they didn't want to be dictated to. They wanted to be able to live their life with the freedom that reflected their values.
Right.
So I think I would just argue that that is in the American tradition to live in that format. And this is where some people would say that the Republicans want to control you in the bedroom and the Democrats want to control you everywhere else.
Right. Yeah, it's very true.
Whether that's fair or not, I think that's kind of a simple thing. But let's say from a standpoint, let's say just someone's going, well, I like the fact that someone is socially moderate and on the other hand fiscally conservative. Maybe they're listening and they're going to say that reflects my values. But what else would you do? I mean, being the governor means you have a host of things you have to work with the legislature, and that will not be controlled by libertarians. That'll be, in all likelihood, be controlled by the Democratic Party as it has been for years. So on things like education, on police force, on pensions, on a host of other, what kind of a policy agenda does the Libertarian Party have as you run for governor that you talk about with voters that you said, if elected, this is what I would do?
Well, I don't think that we can really delve into any policy issues without first addressing the elephant in the room of the collusion and corruption that has existed for decades in Illinois, and it really hasn't been curbed any. We see news story after news story come out. Recently, Chicago, this was what I was talking about yesterday with some people, in Chicago public schools, the sexual scandal there with the rape and assault and molestation of our children that went undiscovered even though they knew about it for a very long time. The incident that occurred with the IG's office within the General Assembly, where the IG, there was nobody present.
That's the Inspector General.
Correct. And where there was complaints of sexual harassment made to the IG's office, but those complaints went unheard because there was no IG to even be found.
For something like 5 years, there was no IG to report the harassment to.
Nothing.
So it was a non-functioning system.
Right. And in all honesty, that's the majority of Illinois. It actually functions in a capacity in which it protects cronyism, it protects the political elite, and it protects the system and industry that they have designed for themselves. We must bring transparency and accountability to that. If we don't address that first, it doesn't matter what policy
and
platforms.
And that is what, when you say address that?
Well, I think that how can we go about developing transparency? I think a great way to do that is to begin incorporating closed-circuit television in all of our political offices. Why is it that, like with the 13-year-old kid, I think over in Kankakee, here recently, that was charged, or could be charged with a felony, eavesdropping, for recording his school administrators. A 13-year-old boy who felt compelled to record them is now looking at a felony charge. Now, whether or not that'll come to fruition or not, I don't know. But here we see where government has taken a substantial role in protecting itself and holding its people that it purports to serve with a different standard, with a double standard. We can't record them, and we can look at this in the judiciary. It's no secret that I take a lot of issue with the judiciary in Illinois and across the country. Why can't you walk in there and record? You can walk in there as a public citizen. It's a public courtroom. We can have the media in there. We have freedom of the press. Why can't we have alternative media? Why can't somebody who is subject to trial record their hearing without fear of reprisal for that? To me, that should sound off. That should put up warning flags for the general public of, well, why can't we do that? What's going on that you don't want me to see? Because there's more to it than I don't want a cell phone ringing in my courtroom. You know what I mean? And we need that transparency in all aspects. I think that we can bring that.
Would it be fair to say in a larger context? I mean, obviously running the Illinois channel, we say it's like the C-SPAN for Illinois, and we're talking about recording, using television cameras to record any number of committee hearings and all that. I will say, as a quick aside, one, the Illinois Supreme Court has installed cameras in their chamber, and they have cameras in the courtroom as an initiative. So actually, a lot of that, to some extent, is being done. It's not 100% across the board. And I don't want to get mired in this thing. I would say for those, since we brought this up, there are sometimes allegations made in a courtroom that are mere allegations, but could destroy someone's reputation if it were televised. I think the judicial system has some legitimate sidebar considerations that are not true of televising a governor's speech or a legislative hearing, where you're focusing on policy rather than the alleged crimes of an individual. And people probably wouldn't even remember if they're guilty or not, but they might remember the allegation. But that said, would you say that in Illinois, it sounds like you're saying, and I was imagining as we were talking, I drive through any number of intersections, as people do, and the government has cameras on us.
That's correct.
So it seems like it is developing to some extent into a one-way street, that government wants to give us a ticket if we color outside the lines, but they don't want to be held accountable by the same token if they are delayed in doing some action, if they fail to take an action, as we talked about the IG in the legislative branch. They didn't even appoint someone. So the women that have lately have come forth with their allegations said, we had no one to report it to.
Right.
And so is that the thing that you think, just from the standpoint of the balance of power between the citizenry and the government, that in Illinois the government has taken the upper hand? Is that
Absolutely.
a theme of yours?
Absolutely. The power there's an extreme power imbalance where our government has far more power and authority than the people. And that's reflective when you talk to people. People in this state feel hopeless. They feel like their vote doesn't matter, their opinion doesn't matter, and that is wrong. People should know that, whenever I speak up about an issue, they should know that that concern is going to be met with a legitimate response from their legislators, and it's not happening. And that's something that I want to see corrected, is that the power and the balance is shifted back into the hands of the people, where the people feel like they're driving the ship and not government. That's how it should be, and that's what I want to see accomplished. And you're 100% right. They monitor us every single day. We have cameras and audio recordings everywhere we go, but in the same token, you're going to hear and see no audio, no video recording from you as a private citizen.
So let's get back to some of the more traditional policy. I mean, we talk about pensions a lot because the pensions are out of control. We talk about property taxes because Illinois has extremely high property taxes. People complain about being taxed out of their homes. Do you have a policy solution that you're offering the voters on these issues?
I do. I've really enjoyed and followed for a while now some of the writings of Ted Dabrowski. He writes articles as a finance...
He's a policy analyst. He's worked for a number of different organizations.
Right. So one time he kind of wrote for Illinois Policy Institute. He broke away, and now he writes for WirePoints. And he and I have met before and spoken, and I've really researched the different ideas and proposals that are out there for working to end the fiscal issues within Illinois. And his really seemed to be the most straightforward and pragmatic that could be implemented. That if we can work towards the legislator, the General Assembly, not being so contentious and fighting against everything, that's a lot of work. It's another sidebar. But incorporating, for property taxes, freeze property taxes for 5 years. Give wages time to catch up a little bit in that 5-year time frame.
A lot of the school funding, not all of it, comes from property taxes.
About 70%.
So how would we finance the schools if we freeze property taxes for 5 years?
Well, they're still going to be financed at current levels, so that wouldn't freeze. Now, what we should be working to do is to reduce the, 860 some odd school districts, not necessarily combining schools, but working to eliminate a lot of the administrative overhead. Paying an administrator who's overseeing 1 or 2 schools a six-figure salary with a seven-figure pension on the backside is ludicrous. I can find right now qualified men and women. I could look to the veteran community. I could look to the business community. I could find men and women that could do that exact same job for far less. But honestly, I don't think that we need more people or to pay people less. I just don't think that we need so much administrative overhead. We need the money to go to teachers and to go to programs for our kids. It doesn't need to be going to an administrator overseeing one or two schools. So I think that if we can work towards that end, it's going to be a great first step. And it's going to allow us the time and the opportunity to also look at other avenues on what can we do differently? Do we have to follow such a traditional course? What if you didn't pay property taxes at all? I mean, what if there was a charter school here and instead you enrolled your kids in the charter school and you didn't pay any property taxes? And instead you used your money to fund and pay to send your kids there.
Have you looked at, as some people have suggested, just getting away from funding the school districts through local property taxes and having maybe a state sales tax at a higher level or the income tax at a higher level, but so that we could bring down the property tax? Is that something that you've talked with any people about? And
yeah, well,
I don't know what your approach would be in those.
What I would really like to do is, of course, is to work towards rolling property taxes back. That's the ultimate goal. I don't want them to stay at current levels. I actually want them to be far less. But to do that, we must revamp in education, about 63 to 70% of your property tax is funding education. We have to look at doing things completely different in our education system. I want to get the federal government out of it as much as possible, as well as the state government. I would like for local districts to manage their education system how they want to without mandates and unfunded mandates from the federal and state government. And I think that that's really what our founding fathers more envisioned, that we're self-governing on a more local level, not from the federal level. And I believe that that's going to, once we begin doing that, it's going to lift some of those burdens off of these local school districts, allow them to use their money wisely as they see fit, and place that two-thirds voter referendum in place for any new levies that they want to incorporate. Let the citizens decide, restore trust and the balance of power back to the people, and allow them to seek a majority vote from their district before they incorporate any new tax levies. Our income tax. I'm not for the J.B. Pritzker progressive income tax because I don't want to increase taxes at all. I want to roll taxes in every avenue backwards as it should be. So kind of to your point, ultimately what I would like to do is eliminate state income tax and transition entirely to a consumption tax. And so for the goods and services that you decide to purchase, which is that's a choice that you make, you have an option in that, that's moral. You have a choice in where that money goes and if you want to spend that. Where with an income tax, it's immoral because you don't get a decision. You have no say in that matter. So I would like to begin with our lowest tax bracket. Those living at and below the poverty line, I would like to give them the ability to write off their income tax. And it's really a very small amount for people living at and below the poverty line.
Well, generally, they would not be paying an income tax.
Right. And so whatever they are paying into, I think we calculated it out at, oh goodness, it was in the tens of millions of dollars. It was really not very much. And we can offset that with legalization of cannabis and taxation of cannabis, as well as reducing the amount of people we're sending to prison for victimless crimes, especially nonviolent crimes. Because we spend an extraordinary amount of taxpayer money to incarcerate people that were never a threat to society. Right.
I don't know how many are violent criminals or not, but I would say at a education conference we recently covered, it was noted that the state spends more for the Department of Corrections than it does for higher education.
Isn't that something? I wish I had the exact numbers in front of me, or I wish that I had them memorized, but I don't. But this puts us in a direction of moving away from an income tax. I don't want people living in poverty, and I don't like welfare.
Some states do operate successfully. Texas and Florida, I know, without an income tax. Tennessee is another one, I
Washington, Tennessee.
So, I mean, sometimes people hear this and they're so accustomed to it here in Illinois that they think that might be an idea that's a crazy idea, but actually I'm not sure how these states without the income tax function and get their taxation. I think they charge more in certain things like a higher tax on cars and different aspects, but the point is it is done. You know, one of the big issues I think is people hear, every time we hear about a third-party candidate, and it is more often probably it's happened at the presidential level with Ross Perot and George Wallace back in 1968, who got like 15% of the vote. A lot of people are going to be thinking, well, this Kash Jackson guy might sound like a nice young man, but doesn't he know he doesn't have a chance? I mean, that would be the presumption that I'm sure you've heard. And what do you say to those who say, why should I waste my vote voting for you, even if I like what you're saying, because of the ingrained nature of the Republican and Democratic Party in Illinois?
You have to break the cycle sometime. And there's no better time than right now. It's really akin to, and I hate to say it in this context, but it's almost like living in a domestic violence situation and having to choose between the fear of the unknown of venturing out and getting away from what's harming you, or to stay with what you know because it's all that you've ever known. And that's really what we have found ourselves in, is that people are conditioned to the pain and suffering, but they're made so afraid that that pain and suffering could increase at the hands of the wrong elected official, that they continue to still vote for evil and for something that really doesn't represent them. And they admit it. They readily admit it to me that, you're right, I think you would be the best guy for the job, but I'm so afraid of J.B. Pritzker or Bruce Rauner getting it that I can't cast my vote for you.
We have had a number of lawmakers, we interviewed one here, a number of Republican lawmakers, something like 15 of them are not running for re-election. They're just leaving the legislature, and in part because they are fed up with the structure of government in Illinois, not as the Constitution says, but the power politics, the way that their voices are throttled, the way they're told to sit down, shut up, and follow directions.
Yep.
I mean, I just offer this to the viewers, that even within the power or the party structure as we have known it, and you have that on the Democratic side as well. We have a number of people who, either on camera or off camera, will say, this is one of the things, it's not worth the effort anymore. They came to achieve good tasks, and yet they're not allowed to.
They're stifled, yeah.
Your background, your career was in the military. Tell us just briefly a bit about your background.
Originally, I was trained to be a machinist mate submariner, so to work on board United States submarines on non-nuclear systems. So I worked on all the different engineering systems that didn't involve the reactor. Hydraulics, high pressure air, diesel engines, refrigeration, atmosphere control equipment, on and on and on. But I really had a very diverse career. I recruited for the Navy. One of the tours that I'm most proud of is doing undersea research and development. And the other one I'm most proud of is having been a recruit division commander, or a drill instructor in layman terms, right up here in Great Lakes. Gained a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience and the ability to work with people from all backgrounds. And I think that that's really the greatest strength that I took from the military, is 2 decades of experience of getting a job done with a diverse group of people that had strong political differences, religious differences, sexual orientation. We never focused on that. We only focused on the mission. The sidebar would be a political debate or religion. Those would be sometimes very heated conversations. But at the end of the day, we knew how to set it aside and focus on the mission and get the mission done. We don't have people like that right now, at least to no great extent, inside the General Assembly or in politics. We need more of that.
We see that certainly in Congress. I used to cover Congress, and now we have the Democrats relative to Trump, their byword is resistance. I mean, they're
Yeah.
just not
Fight.
getting things done.
Just fight.
And it is a shame, and I think a lot of people, this is where they're members of both Congress and the legislature are frustrated by that, because they do want to get things done. There are problems that need to be addressed, and I think over the last 50 years that the political divisions have become more and more pronounced. In fact, 20-something years ago when I was covering the U.S. Congress, we interviewed a freshman in the House of Representatives, and they said, "What most surprised you about Congress?" And they said, "I thought we'd come here to get things done, and I was surprised at how much time we spent trying to figure out how to screw the other guy."
Yeah.
So it's been around for a while, and it's certainly a lot of these divisions, as we've seen over the last 15 years in Illinois politics with Rod Blagojevich and now Bruce Rauner, just some severe divisions. One of the things that we have had you on the Illinois channel before, and you and I have talked off camera, is family law. And anyone who has gone through divorce, especially if they've had children involved, know it is one of the most gut-wrenching, horrible life experiences that anyone goes through. And for a lot of people, it doesn't end with the divorce or with the separation. Representative LaShawn Ford recently had a bill to basically say, unless there is reason to say that one parent is obviously unfit, if they're on drugs, if they're alcoholic, or something that's apparent,
Right.
that otherwise, if they're reasonably an upstanding person and just can't get along with their ex-spouse, that the parenting would be shared. Now, that bill did not pass. I think LaShawn will probably try to float that again in the future. I bring that up for the viewers' background point. So the thing is, this is something I know you feel very strongly about, so let's get into that. What would you want to see happen in family law, and knowing what you know about your own personal experience and having talked with so many others who have gone through the pain of being a parent who has to go through this prolonged custody fight?
Well, I think some of the important aspects that your viewers need to understand is that family law, like every other piece of law, is an industry built on making money for attorneys and a cottage industry. It's not built to protect you or to serve the best interests of your children. Those are misnomers that they use to justify the decisions that they make. And it's a system that is designed extremely well for the players of the game, but it's absolutely set up so that there's no winner here, right? The largest losers of family law is our children and our communities. Family law is one of the largest contributors to suicide in our nation. It's one of the largest contributors to bankruptcy. It's one of the largest contributors to filicide, our children
Filicide meaning?
being killed by their parents. Because these parents were so mentally and emotionally distraught that they killed their own children. And it's happened in Illinois and in other states across this nation.
We hear it periodically through the news.
I have dealt and know of some of the worst cases of these things happening. And they spin the narrative, and that's what they've attempted to do on me, of, well, why are you running? Why are you not working? Kind of hinting towards well, you're just a deadbeat not wanting to pay your child support.
And we should say, as far as background, you owe some child support.
I do.
But you would, because I've heard you argue this before, you would argue, well, what? What would you argue as far as why do you owe child support?
Well, I would argue a couple things. Number one, why does the state of Illinois, in my case, so I was underneath the IDMA chart before it was revised, and at that time it said that I need to pay 28% of my net income. Okay, reasonable on the surface. Okay, but then when they tack on extracurricular activities, they tack on childcare outside of that, and I had a support order on my older son that I had successfully paid for over 12 years with no problems. I'd paid over $60,000, no issues. Okay, in sum total, I've paid over $100,000 between my children. And I'm not complaining about that. I have no problem providing for my children. The problem that I have is what they don't tell you. What they don't tell you is they justify taking a parent like myself, making us, quote unquote, visitors to our children, the standard visitation order of every other weekend and a few hours on Wednesdays. That justifies the state implementing a child support order. I want the media to go one step further and use some of their investigative journalism skills and ask themselves, number one, why is this pertaining to so many cases? And number two, why does the state receive federal subsidies out of Social Security that goes into the state general fund, and correct me if I'm wrong, but whose pensions and whose salaries gets paid out of the general fund? To me, I see an extreme conflict of interest that judges in this state, much like other states, are taking parents like myself, relegating us down to visitors to implement a child support order. So when they enforce that collection process, they receive federal subsidies out of Social Security, out of the Title IV-D of the Social Security Act, that goes into the state general fund that props up and pays this industry known as family law. There's a huge conflict of interest, and they're using children as the pivot point to gain federal funding. To me, it's a grotesque, disgusting system, and not only does it do that to our Social Security and use our children to do it, but it also breaks down families. Why would you bankrupt, for all intensive purposes, take a father or a mother who's been a law-abiding citizen their entire lives and bankrupt them? What would justify in the court's eyes of that being in the best interest of children? Why would you take a man like Tom Doheny, that I spoke about earlier at the press conference, why would you take a man like that who has a successful business, has been a tax-paying, law-abiding citizen his entire life, a pillar in his community, and bankrupt him, taking him to court over 200 times in 2 years? 200 times. It's judicial abuse, and it literally kills people. And that's what I swore to support and defend against.
And who is Tom Doheny?
Tom Doheny was just a gentleman that I heard about in McHenry County. He was a father, I believe 53, 4 children, very successful, was paying $20,000 a month in child support and alimony. And in our society, we just go on about our daily life like, wow, that sucks. Sucks to be this guy. But it's happening every day. And these people that are crying out for help and assistance, they're not getting it. The same way I didn't.
And what
get
happened
it.
to him?
He was incarcerated November 1st of 2017 for contempt because he wasn't paying the entire amount. He wasn't paying the full $20,000 a month. So the judge held him in contempt, put him in jail, the same thing that they did to me, held me in contempt, put me in jail to coerce the payment. It's debtors' prisons. And they're circumventing our constitutionally protected rights. They circumvent the Constitution. No right to an attorney, no right to a trial by jury. Hearsay evidence is permitted all day long. You don't have any audio or video recording capabilities inside the courtroom to provide for an accurate appeal, and most people can't even appeal. This poor gentleman was incarcerated for contempt on November 1st, and on November 18th, he killed himself in the McHenry County Jail. Now we've got 4 children without a father. We have a community that has suffered an extreme loss in this gentleman. But how many are the untolds? All of the ones that don't have that kind of money to sustain that fight, the ones who don't make the headlines, the ones that just idly disappear. One of the greatest reasons that drove me into this was when I happened upon a survey that was conducted from 2008 to 2010. The Veterans Administration and the Office of Child Support Enforcement surveyed 14,000 homeless veterans. And overwhelmingly, they stated their greatest unmet needs revolved around what happens to them when they go through family court. The suspension of driver's license, the incarceration, the back child support, the inability to now have gainful employment. We're keeping a boot heel on people's throats so that the state can receive federal subsidies. So we're killing people, we're driving up bankruptcies, we are having children that now, because we've got over 20 million children in this country growing up without their biological parent. Now we have those 20 million children at an increased risk of depression, suicide, teen pregnancy, dropping out of high school, living on welfare, and committing violent crimes. All of these systemic issues that we keep talking about. How do we curb mass shootings? How do we curb gang violence? How do we curb abortions with pregnant teenagers? How do we curb people living on welfare? And we've got a common denominator right in front of our face, and we refuse to acknowledge it. That the state is artificially manufacturing deadbeat parents. That's what they're doing, so that they can receive federal funding and continue to prop up the industry for the Illinois Bar Association.
This is something that I think you feel, and I know from my own reporting, that there's just a lot of injustice and a lot of damaged families. And we should say it's not just men, it's not just a call against men against women, because
Right.
the Illinois Channel have covered a number of women who have lost custody of their children, and they feel very also aggrieved. And these are not people who, as we said before, are horrible individuals. It's just that there's a lot of injustice that goes on in the family court system, which is mostly out of sight, out of mind for society at large, unless you get sucked into that process. Right. Do you have any solutions you would offer on that, since we brought it up?
Yeah, a couple major ones that I'd like to see. I would like to see where 50-50 legislation is passed, and that's the norm, that moms and dads are considered fit and equal in the eyes of the court. And if a parent wants to be involved and they live within a proximity of 30, 45 minutes or so, an hour maybe tops, of within their children, and 50-50 could be warranted in that situation, then
50-50 is the sharing of time with the children.
Right. And one of the arguments people make is that, well, I don't want my kids living out of a suitcase. Well, honestly, and I don't either, but if you had 50-50 legislation in place or schedules, they actually have to transfer less than an every other weekend and a few hours on Wednesday. There's actually fewer exchanges. And so in a contentious custody proceeding where there's a lot of conflict between the ex-spouses or partners, there's actually less interaction and thereby less room for any type of conflict. We want to minimize and mitigate conflict, right? And so we would be able to do that more feasibly. Child support is the second one. That the state should not be receiving federal subsidies out of Social Security for collecting child support. Shouldn't be doing it. To me, that's an extreme conflict of interest, that a judge who stands to gain financially can reduce my time with my kids. Indirectly. Right.
His salary, his pension is going to be paid irrespective of the behind-the-scenes financing of the state.
Well, that's correct. But regardless, it's money coming into the state. And that judge, he or she, is an actor for the state. I don't mean actor in the acting sense. Right, I just mean that they represent the state. And so they're bringing in money for the state through these custody arrangements that they're ordering. And that shouldn't be occurring. Right? We shouldn't be using children as an ability for the state to gain federal funding.
Let me, it's typical, and I'm not necessarily a big fan. I like people to hear the character of someone running for office. But it's typical to have the little laundry list, the check boxes of different issues. So let's run through, as we've already established, your history and some of the governing philosophy you would bring. On things like funding of K-12 education, gun control, abortion, some of these issues we often get into. What's your approach to these issues?
I'll start with gun control. I'm not for expansion of any new gun laws. There's no empirical evidence that supports that more gun laws are going to make us safer. Addressing what's happening with the school shootings, I believe that we can take more proactive measures to implement safeguards inside our schools, whether that is permitting teachers who have the desire to conceal carry on campus, or implementing armed school security officers. Any number of aspects we could do and look at of making our children safer. Now, the majority of our violent crime isn't occurring in our schools. The majority of it is occurring in areas like the south and west sides of Chicago and East St. Louis. The murder rate and the crime rate is so high that it detracts from potential businesses wanting to move into the area. And how do we go about fixing that? Well, I think one of the best ways to do that is understand how we got there to begin with. And without going into too much history, the war on drugs was a failed policy. We incarcerated entirely too many fathers, leaving mothers to work one and sometimes two jobs so that the kids were raised on the streets, and they began association with other children just like themselves. And with the poor economic opportunities in these communities, it resulted in what we're looking at right now. Children that have raised themselves for decades and children raising other children with an extreme lack of economic opportunity in these communities has resulted in what we have right now. We have children that have a lot of mental and emotional health issues because of where and how they've grown up. They have PTSD, they have depression, they have anxiety. They've got a lot of mental health issues oftentimes that are undiagnosed. And so we have to begin understanding our past and what got us to where we're at today. And then we need to take the steps necessary to correct that. Drug abuse is a health issue, not a criminal issue. We need to deal with it in such a manner. We need to work proactively in these communities. If there's regulation in place that's preventing these communities from opening up businesses, we need to address that. We need to work proactively day in and day out, one block at a time, to develop the economy and making it more viable for people to lift themselves up out of poverty. I don't like welfare, corporate welfare or otherwise. I don't like welfare. But I want people to be able to lift themselves up by their bootstraps, but they have to have some abilities in those communities to do that. And that's something I want to work towards. That will result in less gun crime. It will result in fewer gangs and fewer murders in our state. And it's something that I believe that we can get accomplished. It's just going to take a lot of concerted effort on everybody's part. We can't just pass it off on the community and say, well, they need to change their culture. They glamorize this or they glamorize. No, we're dismissing the overlying issues that cause these problems to begin with. We have to get into those.
And I put on YouTube earlier today as we taped this, you had a press conference at the Capitol, and when I had posted on Facebook, someone said, "Are you pro-life?"
I am pro-life. The problem that I see with conservatives in their pro-life position is that they're not making any headway. And my question is, do you or do you not want to save unborn children's lives? I do. My goal isn't to win an argument with you. So if you're pro-choice and I'm pro-life, I really don't think I'm going to change your position no matter how long you and I debate. What I want to do is save an unborn child's life. So what's the best way to go about doing that? I don't think prohibition is the way. Because if prohibition worked, it would have worked on alcohol. Prohibition would have worked on the war on drugs. Conservatives and Second Amendment supporters will readily come to the opinion and say, well, criminals will still have guns. If you ban guns, if you prohibit guns for law-abiding citizens, criminals are still going to get them. I believe that the same thing holds true for abortion. That I don't want an abortion to occur, but if you make it illegal, if you put prohibition in place, you're going to create a black market, just like what happened with alcohol and drugs and what happened with guns. You create a black market, and now you have to enforce those policies. And now we're talking about locking up 18, 19-year-old young girls who made a poor choice. I don't think so. That's not something I'm comfortable doing. I want to reduce. I would in a dream world, no abortions. Dream world for me. Abortions never happen. But you know what? This is reality. We don't live in that world. They're going to happen. And they're either going to happen in a clinic that is safe for that woman, or they're going to happen in a back alley of a street in Chicago. And I'm not comfortable with the latter. I don't like the other one either, right? But I don't want to create two victims here. And that's what we're looking at doing. I want to reduce significantly the amount of abortions occurring, not just in the state, but the nation. But just like dealing with gun crime and violence and people living on welfare, we need to have an honest conversation about the root causes, most of which are economic, most of which is just a young mom doesn't feel as though she has the ability to provide for that child, and she doesn't want to bring a child into this world to face uncertain circumstances because her future is uncertain. Let's get to that. Let's get to where people have more options for developing themselves professionally, and for those who just say, you know what, a child's not for me, but I will bring it to term and make it available for a loving couple out there who can't have children. I mean, and I think that there's a pathway to that, but it's just finding that pathway that we need to achieve.
One thing I should also point out, then, I think one of the reasons you're running for governor is relative to the Libertarian Party, that you would like it to be a permanent party, and for it to be automatically on the ballot, you have to get 5% of the election, and then maintain that 5%. The
Right.
Green Party a few years ago, Rich Whitney ran, he got 5%, and they were on the subsequent, but I think their vote total fell off, and now they're not, no longer on the statewide ballot. So the party, and that's something I think you had expressed at the Capitol and some others in the party, that you, in fact, not only are you running yourself, you have a lieutenant governor candidate, you have a secretary of state candidate, and a slate of candidates for the other statewide offices, as I understand.
Absolutely.
Who is your lieutenant governor, and what's just an inkling of their background?
Sanj Mohip, he's out of Chicago, and he's in the IT industry, was a teacher before, and like myself, he's very liberty-minded. He just wants to expand personal liberty for all people. I think that's one of the best parts about libertarians, that I don't care what your belief system is. I want you to live it. I don't care what your neighbor's belief system is. I want them to be happy and pursue that life as readily as they choose, without government dictating to you and all of your neighbors how you should choose to live your life or run your business. We need to get government out of that, and I think that that's what people want. They just don't know exactly what that looks like.
Well, Kash Jackson, hopefully we gave him a little bit of a peek of what it would look like in this conversation, and we'll follow some of your campaigning throughout between now and November, and good luck to you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Terry.